So discussing life in the Khmer Rouge has shifted and is claimed as part of the identity of this 1.5 or 2.0 generation, even as the writing style had shifted, sometimes to relay collective memories rather than individual stories. These are stories I collected from an aunt or from a mother, and sometimes written in the form of fiction. A kind of awareness of themselves as in some ways benefiting from, but also simultaneously being trapped in the role of victim stands out in some of this work. I remember years ago coming across a section of a graphic novel posted online, and the drawings were images of killings, where the Cambodian author, artist, illustrated seeing people being killed when she was a child. She then tells about being invited to a public discussion of violence, where she is there with speakers from other conflict zones, and she's asked to go first because her story is the best, meaning, the most horrific. I didn't print this. I'm so sorry that I didn't print it at the time, and the next time I went back to look for it on that URL, it was gone. So I wondered if she didn't withdraw from telling the story because she couldn't control the uses for which the story might be deployed. And while not a common occurrence, I have had young Khmer Americans tell me that sometimes they lie and say, I'm Chinese or I'm some other ethnic group, just so they don't have to face going through discussing the Khmer Rouge regime, violence, and so on. So it's this not wanting to be put in this position of victim. Two other phenomena in the 2000s and now at the 2010s merit attention when we speak of Khmer identity. The first is the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, criticized by many, especially many Cambodian Americans, for being too little too late, or for being too influenced by the current government. The tribunal has nonetheless meant the public telling of stories of that era to a new world audience and to a new generation inside the country. It certainly seemed to many that this generation was not paying much attention. I helped to supervise a research project where two NIU undergraduate students interviewed students in Cambodia about their opinions about the tribunal and about a new textbook that was just being introduced to teach about the Khmer Rouge time in Cambodian schools. And what they found was that almost none of the young people they interviewed were paying any attention or knew very much about the tribunal at all. In fact, one of the Cambodian students that was being interviewed went to a session of the tribunal and watched it because she decided that if this American student, it had been so important that this American student had traveled all the way to the other side of the world to ask her about it, you know, maybe she should pay attention. But I would argue that for tens of thousands of Cambodians who attended the tribunal in person, and for the hundreds of thousands who saw portions of the trial on TV or who followed testimony online, it was important to finally have someone held accountable. Since Khieu and Nguyen Chia still deny culpability, the role of confessor has fallen on Gan Kai Yiu, also known as Duc, the commandant of the notorious S-21 Torture and Execution Center. He's the only person who has publicly declared his own guilt and taken responsibility for the terrible crimes during this regime. And I always try to devour these first-person narratives whenever they come out. And here's the new hot one just off the presses, Ritti Pine's book, The Elimination. I'm only partway through it. Ritti Pine is the filmmaker. He's made several wonderful films, but maybe he's best known for the movie S-21, which is one of the films I'll show you on the list here in a minute, which is a story about this torture and execution center. It was called S-21 during the Khmer Rouge regime. It's also known as the Dual Slang Museum, which is what it's called now. Ritti Pine got together 3 of the survivors. Somewhere between 14 and 17,000 people went into that place, and there were only 12 known survivors. Before the tribunal, there were only 7 known survivors. 5 more names came up over the course of the tribunal, so it's another way you can see it as a form of documentation. So he got these 3 survivors, and then he went out to the countryside and he found 6 or 7 of these they had been young men in their teens and early 20s who had worked there as torturers and executioners, and he puts them together in the same place and makes them talk to each other for days and days and days. And it's really quite an astonishing film. Have people seen that one? A couple people. It's too long to show in a class period. I sometimes set it up for my classes to watch outside of the class period, but then you have to have conversations afterwards, or serve whiskey, yeah, serve heavy alcohol, because it is a very difficult film to watch. So this is that filmmaker, and he's been given the opportunity to interview Duc. So he's done this whole film about this institution that Duc created and ran. You know, he designed the torture methods, and he trained the torturers, and he's now taken responsibility for that and is talking. And so interwoven is Ritti Pine telling his story during the Khmer Rouge with the story of making the movies, with the interviews cutting to the interview with Duc. So it's really an interesting book. So the tribunal, and I think also the fact that so many Khmer Rouge survivors are now aging and people are beginning to die, the tribunal has stirred up the past and has made the telling of Khmer Rouge first-person stories more urgent. And that's why I think now there's yet another round of these coming out. I have a list of 35 here, but I know it's probably half of what is out there. And these are in English, so there's more in French and other languages. I've been involved for several years with a project at the Cambodian American Heritage Museum and Killing Fields Memorial in Chicago that collected the life histories of Cambodian elders. These stories were then analyzed, discussed, and themes drawn out and molded into an exhibit, which is the current exhibit on display at the Cambodian American Museum. And at the end of today, I'll run through some pictures and show you some images of that exhibit. The second phenomenon of the 2010s that brings to the fore issues of Cambodian identity, borders, and space is the deportation of Cambodian Americans convicted of felonies in the U.S. In 2002, the government in Cambodia signed an agreement and agreed to accept 1,600 Khmer Americans who faced deportation from the United States. These men, and a few women, left Cambodia as babies or were born in the refugee camps as Thailand. So they had never gone through the process to become American citizens. They have no memories of Cambodia, most do not speak the language, and few have relatives who can help orient them to this completely new society. Because many parents did not want to tell their stories of the Khmer Rouge years, many know little of their own family history before or during the revolution. Cambodia, for these young people growing up, as for many Khmer Americans, so you have this double Cambodia as a source of pride, Angkor Wat and music and arts and so on, and Cambodia as a source of shame or embarrassment, just a place of violence. Now suddenly they have to figure out how to live there. Some left spouses and children in the United States. There's been some press coverage of their plight, mainly focused on challenging the deportations and asking for individual hearings rather than a blanket policy of deportation. Many of these deportees were convicted of minor crimes in an area of very strict sentencing laws and were often advised by public defender lawyers to plead guilty and go ahead and serve the time and so as to not go through a trial and risk even larger sentences. But they had no way of knowing that this law would be retroactively applied after 9/11, so that anyone who had been convicted, even if they had served their time, come out, gotten married, had kids, gotten on with their life, would then years later be deported over those crimes. Their lives have been explored in films by Anita Yo Ali, herself a Cambodian American, and released through her studio, Studio Revolt. I've got another clip to show you from that. So here are self-identified exiled Americans dreaming of Cocoa Puffs and Saturday morning cartoons, memories of their lives in LA, Boston, and Chicago. The notion of a single Cambodian American identity stands shattered in the face of their plight. I think it's no longer possible to think of one Cambodian American or Khmerican identity, if it ever was. I was asked to do a radio show out in Seattle a couple of years ago, talking about Cambodians in America. I was on before the other guest, Tracy Harachi, who teaches social work at the University of Washington. When I was asked about how Cambodian Americans were doing in the U.S. 25 years on, I spoke about the Cambodian American Association in Chicago and their museum, and about Cambodian American students at NIU, where I teach, as student leaders, graduating as engineers, teachers, and other professionals. But then I stayed on the line to listen to the interview with Dr. Harachi to hear about broken families, unemployment, gangs, and problems with drugs in South Seattle. We were both right, of course. We were both looking at different facets of the very complex story of what it means to be Cambodian American. Increasingly, these diverse stories are told by Cambodians and Khmer Americans themselves. Scholars like Kataria Om, whose wonderful piece I included in the packet that you have, this piece on exile and memory, offers a fascinating insider's view of her own search for what it means to be Khmer. The creative genius of U Sam Ur's poetry, Riti Pang's films, the wonderful sculptures of Sophia Buck, the new choreography of Chan Ketchache, or the music of Chinnery Om, or now today I see also the pottery of Yari in the back there, all offer vibrant explorations of Khmer culture or Khmer American culture in the making. So if you know those works, was anyone able to get down to New York to see any of the seasons of Cambodia? Yeah, I didn't go either, but I understand the dance was just stunning. Sophia Bick's, these large rattan sculptures that were at the Museum of Modern Art. At the Cambodian conference last year in Dachau, there was a remarkable set of dance performances. Sophie Ling Shapiro Pim, who did for a long time in the 80s and late 80s and early 90s, when Cambodian dance was just getting going again, and there was a very strong emphasis on retaining everything exactly as it had been. And so dancers learned from the last old dance mistresses before they died, every hand gesture, every movement. And Sophie Ling Shapiro Pim was one of the first who sort of dared to make small changes. She kept much of the same style of movement, but she added new stories. She wrote new words. And then, so we saw her perform, then we saw a second performance that included not only changes to the stories, but also changes to some of the traditional movements. And then the third performance by Chan Ketchache was this very modern, sort of, leaping around the stage in something that, Cambodians in their 60s would not think of as Cambodian dance, and yet it had elements from traditional Cambodian dance. And so it's that range of creativity. I don't know, are people familiar with Chinnery Om's music? Yeah, so it's not, we had him out we did a concert of his work in his honor for the conference last year. And some Cambodians came out from Chicago thinking that it was going to be Cambodian traditional music. And it's really not at all. I mean, it's not Western classical music. It's not Cambodian music, traditional Cambodian music. Yes?
Actually, we had a concert of his music here last year as well. Sebon, our viola professor here, and pianist Carmen Peralta performed that. And we actually had it in conjunction with a master drummer who was here from Cambodia. So they played Chinnery Om's contemporary Western, based interpretations of Cambodian music, and we also had the traditional music. So it was a good concert here.
So that's the end of the talk, and I'm going to shift gears and talk about the films, but I'll stop and let people, see if people have questions before we take our break.
Thank you. I wondered, because so much of your work seems to focus on gender and cultural spaces and cultural identities, if you might talk a little bit about ways in which these identities may fragment along gender lines as well.
Absolutely, and then I thought about how to add it and couldn't figure out how to add it without adding it everywhere. In the first person narratives, I've already mentioned that I think this more recent wave of first person narratives are very different because of gender. The first wave, there's a couple of exceptions. Tida Mann's book, which she wrote with Joan Criddle, is one of the earliest ones, but many of them were written by urban upper class men who had gained high status and then lost it as a result of the revolution. And in that second wave, they were mainly young girls, still from wealthy families generally, but their experience of the revolution was of a loss of their world, combined with they're more likely to talk about a breakdown of networks and a loss of family in a particular way that I think is different from. I have a student who's just finished a master's degree on this, where she read a bunch of these first person narratives and discusses them in gender terms. And they are more likely to describe witnessing violence, which you don't think that women would have seen it more than men, but they're maybe more willing to talk about it, and then to talk about rape and sexual violence. If you read the sort of standard books on the Khmer Rouge period, David Chandler, Carl Vickery, Steve Hedder, Ben Kiernan, those books, they basically say there wasn't any sexual violence in the Khmer Rouge because the Khmer Rouge punished it, would kill a cadre for rape. And indeed, there are records of, even at S21, there was record of sexual violence and rape, and the guard who did it was killed. But the fact that it could happen there, at the place where the panopticon, the place where everyone is looking, it certainly happened many places, and I don't think it's really been talked about until this round of first person stories. And I think it's because they grew up here, and it's not the automatic, if you were raped, it's your fault. They grew up in America where a woman who's a rape victim is a victim. So there's more, it's more acceptable for them to talk about it. There's very little literature. I can think of one example of a writing, and there's also a short film that goes with it that DC Cam did of a woman rape survivor. What's her name? Dan Kim. It's a short little book, and then there's a short film that goes with it. But she's removed herself from life as ordained as a nun and kind of withdrawn. But I think it was far more common than those historical works lead us to believe, just because it usually happened when people were being taken to be killed. So they would rape them and they would kill them. So there was never anyone to tell the story. And in fact, in Dan Kim's case, she was sent out with a group to be killed, and the men sort of chose women and took them off separately to rape them first. And the guy that took pity on her and let her go.
I just want to share an experience, because interview with women, it doesn't mean they would tell us exactly or immediately about the sexual violence or imprisonment unless we touch on the sensitive issue. For example, from experience with interviewing Thai Muslim women, it was very hard for me to hear their story, to encourage them to tell that kind of story, because it's kind of very shameful for them. and also because they live in a community, strict rule on those kind of things. And in my book about Chinese women experience, I found only one who was sexually abused, but she said that it was not successful brain, it was like sexual assault, and it was very hard for her to tell me the story. So I would say it's not easy to just approach the person or the women and then be expected she would tell us the story immediately unless we try to explore more in order to understand. So it's very sensitive.
In the interviews that I've done, sometimes when people are telling their stories about Khmer's time, they'll get to a point in the story where they just stop talking. And my assessment is also that's the point at which they were raped. But women often won't say it, can't say it.
Thank you for telling us about the field and how the field has evolved over the years. And it's wonderful to think about how we can teach both Asian studies and Asian American studies together and using the refugees and diasporic perspectives. And in terms of the first person narrative versus the scholarship from historians and anthropologists as well. I noticed that recently Kathy Shun-Willis has a new book called Memory Work. Have you looked at it yet?
I haven't, no.
She's from University of Connecticut and did Asian American Studies, looking at genocide and memory. I don't know, because I was going to ask your opinion about the book because she's
okay. No, it's Willis.
no, Kathy Shun-Willis. She's in Asian American Studies field at UConn. Yeah.
Do you have a reaction to it?
No, I haven't read it,
Oh.
so that's why I wanted to see what you think about it. I used Su Jin Chang's collection of stories about Cambodians when I teach my Asian American survey.
Survivors?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've used that one before
What do you
too.
think about that?
I think that's also a good book. And she has another story about what's called Not Just Victims, which is specifically about MAA's, Mutual Assistance Association.
Right. One is more based on the interviews. The other one is her own narrative. I find it useful to do exercise.
Have you ever tried to use Buddha as hiding?
No, I wouldn't use for undergrad students.
Question?
These are movies that I use in teaching. And I don't know if you're familiar with them. I'm happy to just sort of talk about the ones I like the best and why I like them. And you can interrupt me and ask questions as I go. Cambodia, The Prince and the Prophecy, or it's also called Cambodia, Kampuchea. And it depends on how it's marketed. Sometimes it's Cambodia/Kampuchea is how it was sold, and it's the two films together on one videotape. But that's the filmmaker is Jim Durand, Australian filmmaker. The reason I like it so much is that he has a lot of the original clips. He has, there was a Yugoslavian film crew that visited Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge regime, and some of the most famous shots you've probably seen of sort of people building these massive irrigation projects, everybody in black, sort of moving across this landscape, carrying dirt, are from that film crew, and he got permission to use those. He also was able to get some Chinese footage.
Into speakers,
Okay.
so hopefully we don't blast people out in their seats. So get ready.
Yeah, so we got Vietnamese footage, you got segments. It starts from 54 to 75, and then it's 75 to 79.
About 10 kilometers from the Portland Airfield for the weapons yard of about 4 hectares of area. It contains thousands of tons of artillery ammunition. Weapons were sent in by taking in such quantities that the forces not really in transport of storehouses.
This is quite long, so I'm going to jump.
One is never kept. It has to be for trade.
This is dual slang, inside dual slang as the Vietnamese found it.
When came to this prison on the 14th of January 1979, there were 11 dead bodies in 11 former classrooms. And one body died in
Sorry to give a warning, Mike.
In this account, we found a large number of prisoners' files and photographs. After killing a prisoner, the police were killed. That is now. How can he have so many?
The movie's called The Prince and the Prophecy. There's a famous Cambodian set, it's not one prophecy, people talk about it as one, but it's a set of prophecies called the Book of Mie, about, I won't call it a cycle, I'll call it a wave. But this decline that happens when you get far away from the birth of a Buddha, and in the middle of the Kalpa, you sort of hit rock bottom, and then Cambodians talk about the Khmer Rouge time as the fulfillment of those prophecies, which they talk about. They didn't get the whole lecture on limited, great, vast times for Kalpas. So Kalpa's 5,000 years, then we've just hit that midpoint at 2,000, just over 2,500 years. So who is the prince in the prophecy? So in Jim Duran's movie, he interviews Sihanouk, and Sihanouk, through the course of the interview, sort of casts himself as this savior, which is kind of ironic if you know the whole story of Sihanouk.
That the men like Pol Pot and Hitler can have supporters. That is a phenomenon that in conformity with the misery of our mankind, our earth.
He kind of just lets him go on and hang himself. It goes up and talks about all the way up to 79. There's a young Steve Etter.
Members for police to learn their faith.
And then 70, all the way up to 79 people at the end of the Khmer Rouge trying to go back and find one another. And there's footage of that too. So.
It seemed impossible in a land of plenty, but in the wake of Vietnam's military takeover, hundreds of thousands died during 2 long.
All right. For trying to get a film that fits within the hour-long class or hour and 15-minute class, Return to the Killing Fields, which is narrated by Bill Curtis, is an okay attempt. So most of it is about the Khmer Rouge regime, but then he's back in Phnom Penh and talking about recovery. So it's 96, but it tells the story in a digested sort of way that you can get in an hour class. The Killing Fields, of course, most of you probably know. The movie about Viet Tron's life. And again, it's too long to show in a class period, but you can do clips from it. The Pol Pot biography. The Nightline episode. I don't think I have this one here. On the trial of Pol Pot. Why is it not going to? It must be broken. So much that I didn't come up with, so it's rendered. Okay. good about this is that you see him. I mean, Pol Pot was interviewed twice. He was interviewed by Elizabeth Becker and that group that went into Cambodia. He was interviewed by this Yugoslavian film crew. And then he's interviewed here as an old man. When the Khmer Rouge decided to distance themselves from Pol Pot and say, we're not communists anymore, we're really great people. And they arrested Pol Pot and they did this sort of show trial. And they brought in Nate Thayer from Thailand with a cameraman, and they shot this footage of him talking. And he looks like this really helpless grandfatherly figure walking with a cane. It's just sort of interesting to see him. And then he died within a year of that. Dies in 98. All right, that was all.
Experiments, your social and political organization, the direct executions of many thousands of people, many innocent families suffered. The country itself also suffered because of your policies. Many of your fellow Cambodians want to know whether you feel any remorse, whether you acknowledge that you also made very serious mistakes while you were in power.
This is for Cambodian television. They cut in the scenes of Jules Lake of S21 while he's talking. If you can get the original episode of Nightline, you can get just him talking without the other thing. Okay, S21, Ricky Pime's film, I've already talked about. This bringing together of the people who were survivors of S21 with the torture and executioners who worked there. and having them speak to each other. Really the star of that film was Von Natt, the painter, who's one of the survivors of S-21, and he just passed away last year. But he lived long enough to see the dude found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. I was there on the day they read the verdict in the Duig trial, and Von Natt was sitting there. I went over to him and I said, I'm so glad, he said, I'm so glad you lived long enough to see this. But that was what I was thinking, I'm so glad that you're here to see this. But that's an incredible movie for classes, not just about Cambodia, but sort of classes, and I use it in a class I teach on cultures of violence, things about genocide, how how could people do that to other people, the larger questions. That's quite a remarkable film. Then Enemies of the People is a newer film. Rob Lemkin and Samphat Kid. Samphat Kid is a journalist, and over the course of many years, he went up to interview Nguyen Chia. So Pol Pot was number 1, Nguyen Chia was number 2 in the Khmer Rouge regime. And he was living up on the Thai-Cambodian border, free man. And Samphat would go every weekend. He'd drive all the way from Phnom Penh up to the border and interview him. And he'd go interview him every weekend. And he got to know him really well. And he shot lots of footage of Nguyen Chia talking. And over time, he got to know him so well that he finally relaxed his guard and really talked. And this film is the result of setting up, talking about Nguyen Chia's role and airing those interviews. And then these interviews were used as evidence at the tribunal of Nguyen Chia's.
We're trying to reload.
Yeah. Trying to reload it. Yeah, I just got too many things open at once. Okay. Control.
If anyone's better at it than I am, by all means.
I think money of real basically meant. I try to get close to him to make him confident to say the truth. Why something important lies in the killing fields. This is the first step. I talk to you later. At least the killing like this. So far, I enjoy it.
Okay, last one, is it time to take one? The last one on the list there, of the Khmer Rouge ones, and then I'll stop for a break. Chai Boraz, Lost Loves, has not yet been released on DVD or video. It's shown at some film festivals. We showed it last year at the Cambodia conference, but so far I haven't been able to get a copy of it. And it's a feature-length film telling the story of Chai Boraz's wife and her family during that time period. And it's a very accurate depiction, reenactment of things that happened as a work of semi-fiction. And the hall that we watched it in, there were a lot of Cambodians in the room who I know personally, and I know their stories. And they had very similar stories to the stories that was being shown in that film, and they sat there. But a lot of Americans that I know, Euro-Americans that I knew, got up and walked out. They just sort of couldn't take it because it was really overwhelming. But that one, I think, he is negotiating for distribution currently, and it should be available. Lucky Child is then a follow-on book. The second book contrasts her life with that of her sister who stayed in Cambodia. So one girl growing up in America, and the other sister growing up in Cambodia. And there's a couple of other really unusual ones. Red Undertow. This is also new. It looks like it's self-published. I bought it in the airport in Phnom Penh, but it's an ethnic Chinese who was sympathetic to the Chinese Revolution. And when the Khmer Rouge first came to power, he sort of presents himself. Here I am, ready to be a comrade, happy to join the revolution. And it follows his story through that time period. And then Reflections on a Khmer Soul, Navi Kum is, she was born in 1975 and has no memories of Cambodia, and in fact has no memories of the camp. The book is really about her growing up as a Cambodian American, but sort of in the shadow of these earlier events. And hers has a definite tone of, all these books are written by rich city people and blame the base people, the old people out in the countryside for everything that happened, but I come from the base people. I come from the countryside.
Doesn't that get, I've seen reviews where there's a lot of, or blogging, or pushback.
There is,
Yeah.
absolutely. When Burke class wrote, okay, so you'll have that entire list. Showing it discussing those readings in conjunction with the films, especially with the cycle of return films like New Year Baby, I find is a very a good way to draw people into the story and to get them to really think about how somebody's life could be completely different from their own. Then people want to that introduction to Southeast Asia class. That's sort of the goal of those sessions. We each have them for that one session. and try to draw them into the minor or the concentrating in Southeast Asia. So do you have questions about those or about other teaching methods? Yep.
This is kind of a self-serving question. I'm wondering, one of the things that came up in discussion yesterday was ways in which our students are sometimes resistant to not just the other, but to engaging questions of difference or questions of history or whatever it might be. And so I'm wondering if you have done or would recommend having students engage in some kind of autoethnography, and maybe engaging or creating first-person narratives of their own as a way to use craft, in a sense, to see or find ways into engaging with these kinds of narratives. Or maybe the question of resistance isn't one that you can tell
I
me.
haven't tried to have students write their own first-person narratives. I did teach a class. The last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk about this life history project that we did. And I did teach a class where I had students help to process this set of life histories, where there were 50 life history interviews that had been done, most of them done in Khmer, but we had them translated, and I took them and divided them out. Each student got a set of them, and then they went away and read them, and they were supposed to pull out themes from across the different stories. And then we all came back together as a group, and everybody discussed what they had pulled out and why, and sort of tried to take them into the stories that way. And then the themes that the students pulled out in those sessions, there were a couple of Cambodian American students in this session, but most of them were Euro-American students, then got used to help produce this museum exhibit. So, and there were students a couple of students who got into it enough that they then worked as interns in the museum as they were putting together the exhibit. So, I don't know if there's a parallel sort of way that you could try to involve students directly with community members. There's also a life history project up in Montreal where students are doing video interviews with Cambodian elders there, and the goal is to create an online video archive of all of those life history interviews.
There's also a local project that Light of Cambodian Children is doing. It's called More Than a Number. So what they're doing is having a visual exhibition of communities, transit photos, and then they collect the stories of people, what was life like in Cambodia, how they get here, what's it like here. So they've done the coherent one, they've done it, and they've done it in Providence. So I'm planning for iteration. Somebody's doing more work locally.
There's also a movement, some people out of Cal State Long Beach were trying, they knew that there were several different places around the United States and Canada where these different history things had been done, and they started an effort to try to pull them together and make them all accessible in one place through one system. And I think they wrote a grant to try to get money to do that and didn't get the grant, but I don't know if the effort has completely died out. All right, so this began, well, let me tell you a little bit. Cambodian American Heritage Museum and Killing Fields Memorial. This is in Chicago. Opened in 2004. Their museum side before it had been a social service entity. So they raised money to expand their building. And it's the place in the United States that has a memorial to the Cambodians who died during the Khmer exhibits. The first one was called Our Journey Continues, which was the story of them coming from the refugee camps and settling in Chicago. The second one, Khmer Spirit, was a show. Khmer Spirit and Cambodia Born Anew. This is a collaboration with the museum and the anthropology museum at NIU. Spirit, the arts opened at this museum, and then Cambodia Born Anew on contemporary life opened at the anthropology museum at NIU. After a year, they switched so that both communities got to see both shows. And then witnessing the Cambodian killing fields, the current exhibit was part of this Life History Project. We had funding from the Henry Luce Foundation, and some of the interviews were done by my students, anthropology students, and some were done by Cambodian American students that the museum chose. Credits. Anita Ali, who's Studio Revolt, is doing the work on the deportees, the graphics. And actually, Sochi Tabaco, who did baby, ended up doing a short film that you can see at the beginning. So from these life interviews, themes emerged: evacuation and collectivization, breaking down the civil order, living in constant fear, and then the killing fields. And we laid these out across the different themes. Then we sort of pulled quotations from the different interviews and plugged them in and moved them around. And this became much larger and covered a whole table and sort of laid out what people wanted in and came up with it. And then we took it to the Cambodian board, and then they said no to the ideas, and they changed others until it went to the exhibit designer who came up with this exhibit. So you come in for the museum, and here you see this short film, sort of taken from 75 up, and then you come in on the and then the more incorporated to the exhibit and last section on how it survived. I went to a lot of these images came from CAM. Some of the images we had to use, others of them people graciously allowed us to use them. All the text is in English and Khmer. So popular the Cambodian entire exhibit. Yeah, there's two boards. The Cambodian Association of Illinois parent, and the Cambodian Museum Memorial is the child. And so one is under there. And also been very good for them, writing grants together, being able to acquire objects for their museum with the grants fund. And the experience that the Cambodian Americans have had coming and seeing the exhibit and seeing reactions to the different exhibits. Sometimes that's prompted those conferences like CIC, Madison, they stopped in Chicago, and she had the name of her, and so she come with moving experience for and then there was who said, "Oh, your father was so," and he was my teacher, and then they so it's like that pilgrimage place for Americans to go.
So, like, what happens next? Or I mean, I realize that it's big now, so they have that changing of, take. But, so does it, what kind of traffic does it get? Or events they hold there, or how did it stay important community, but how did they consciousness?
They hold a ceremony there, a ceremony for the fun festival at the fall, and they hold a ceremony there on April 7th or thereabouts each year in the spring for the beginning of the first period they memorialize. They've fallen on very tough times because of state budget cuts in Illinois, so that the social service side isn't bringing in as much money as it used to, and so they've cannibalized staff from the museum side in order to keep the social service agencies running, which is more important. So it's not open full-time anymore, and if you want a group, you need to call and make an appointment to go. So it's
Do they have like those school groups come?
they do have school groups come, yes. And there's a mandate, in fact, the Association of Illinois was one of the groups that set a mandate in the state of Illinois that you have to teach genocide, about genocide at the high school level. It's, they wrote it into law that you had to teach it, but they didn't provide any what it should be like or how you should teach it. And so there was a scramble for a time to try to develop some materials, but in the success materials is mention of this museum in Louisville, and school groups do come to visit. Different universities take students here.
Is it your undergraduates or your graduate students that are involved?
This project was graduate students. Yeah. I take my Asian American class, I get a band trip into the city. We go to the Cambodian, we go to
There were some changes that took place in the initial vote of the board. Were those changes about what you changed arrangement or things, or were they changes in what you remember about the past and what you think should be recorded about the past?
That's a great question. In one of the mock-ups, you'll see that there's a map of Cambodia on the floor. And as you came in, it was going to show the evacuations where people had been pushed out. And Cambodians were absolutely opposed because you can't step on Cambodia. It would be offensive to put your feet on a map of the country.
Do you remember the controversy for that citizen who had put a picture of Angkor Wat on the floor top of his toilet, and he got arrested years ago? And also that playing card controversy where they retracted all these Angkor Wat playing cards because it said by the government that they would be falling underneath the heat of the people in bars. Similar idea.
And then the original idea for this area was to be about the tribunal. So after you had been through, then there would be this discussion of the Khmer Rouge tribunal, and there were presenting it as though there's some sort of resolution, some sort of solution at the end of this, and there's not. The tribunal doesn't provide that, so it shouldn't be presented as such. So it's changed instead to this, how I survived as a different, and then now, since Van Nat passed away, they've actually changed the design, and along this wall are a set of Van Nat's sketches in a little area that's dedicated to telling me. Bought them when he was still alive. Yeah, the museum purchased them.
Is there a museum in Long Beach? No. Is there a museum in Long Beach?
There's not. There's something called a museum in Seattle, but apparently there's some things that a guy put in his garage. I mean, it's not a really nice museum like this one.
So basically, it's the only one.
Yeah. A lot of places, if you read it, it will say there are two. This one and the one in Seattle. But
How big is the Cambodian Museum?
I think the similar pattern to the one you have here is what this says, but then what they say. The census, I had something like 5,000, but it's much higher. For reasons people are underreported.
Are they more or less one neighborhood?
They used to be, when there was one area of Chicago near where there are two temples, and I understand there's a parallel to the sort of battling temples, are in that neighborhood too. But then as people got economically more stable, they moved out. And then another wave of migrants coming behind. A lot of Bosnians and other Guatemalan Americans.
Are people living a civic life? Council?
It needs to be earlier. Chicago is a ethnic politics, and there are only a place that can put this together. That's is going founded just ago, a woman in there. Turn it over before the but he's and I think he learned early how to play Chicago and how to make alliances for Asian American communities to be able to and Korean and been at one time a Korean neighborhood, and through those alliances was able to get state for a variety of just outside the cross where this is for overgrown areas and stuff, river, it's very attractive, and organized the elements of that community. They're making a peace park along the river there that features sets of statues.
It's kind of difficult. So I keep hearing that museum and I interviewed him and said at one point, Killenfields come back to
life, and they got. And I do think that part of it as a permanent better it has to do with survivors aging, mortality, and desire to tell the story right now. And maybe that too will pass, and they'll decide to change it out. And partly it's prompted by the tribunal. When we went back to the 50, we did 50 originally, and then we went back to do the video interviews, and 2 people had died. And another woman was incapacitated and couldn't talk. And so already, the ones that we had collected could no longer. That's part of it. But indeed, I think all those other artists and writers and musicians and that I talked about are indeed moving far beyond.
It was exhilarating in New York. There was an entire festival with hundreds of performers and events, and the jazz didn't come. It was an incredible experience.
Well, and that was the theme of the conference last year too. What's imagining Cambodia, and specifically imagining it beyond the post-conflict society. Yeah.
I wonder if I might comment on that also. When I bring this subject up in my world music class, I do give them a background about what happened, about the music in Cambodia centuries ago and dance, and then what happened with the Khmer Rouge. And then I talk about my experience in visiting people at the Royal University of Fine Arts. And, you know, there's a lot of focus on preserving the traditional music and the traditional arts. But what they asked me to do, and I thought this has been such an interesting journey for me, they asked me to help them to get Western stringed instruments so that they could teach their students Western classical music, and so that they could form the first national symphony orchestra since before the Khmer Rouge. So the young people are wanting to move forward. They are wanting to do these bridgings of cultures. They want to take their place on the world stage. They want to be part of the world community. And I think there's a vitality in that is wonderful. It's not that they want to dismiss the past because of that proof that they also teach the traditional music, but they also want to be part of the contemporary world. I think it's
At the
encouraging.
same time, you can't teach about contemporary society without talking about the Heritage Group. So much is influenced by it. And,
Yeah, because the Khmer Rouge period is part of our identity more or less. We have to connect ourselves with that. Even the young generation, we have to teach them, but then not in a way that we put ourselves as something all the time, but I mean, we move forward, but we never forget the past. That's why one of the films produced by DC Camp for River Chain Force, that one excluded the Khmer Rouge background, just started with globalization right now. What happened to Cambodia as a post-conflict society when people try to engage with the world, to recognize, to move forward, but then they still have all these problems in the ground, like facing all the development, the negative effect of the development. So I mean, sometimes it is very hard, especially for the older generation, because they live through with the past experience. And for the young generation, some of them would know very little about the Khmer Rouge period. And so on one hand, we don't want them to forget, but to remember in a way that they can remember in order not to repeat the past, to move forward. So it is very hard for Cambodia right now to deal with these issues.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Judy. Many, many, many didn't get one of these, we've got the paper here, but also everything's up online.